Hey, it's Paul from License to Pass. Today we're going to talk about the 13 books that you're allowed to bring into the testing room if you're taking the Florida Contractors exams, the Division I Contractors exams. Before I continue, if you like this content, if this is useful for you, please like this video and share this with your friends who ought to be listening and watching this. Also, check us out at license2pass.com. That's where we sell the books and the test prep. I will share in those videos the hidden content in these books. It'll make it a lot more reasonable for you to pass these tests. So there are 13 books. You can use 4 of them on the business and finance exam. You can use 11 of them on project management and contract administration. There's 2 books. You can watch at either one. I'm going to have markers on the video on YouTube so you can go to the one you need if you need it. And without further ado, the Division I Contractors exams approved reference books. That's for the general contractors, the building contractor, and the residential contractor. All right, the first book we're going to look at is The Builder's Guide to Accounting. This is a very straightforward and useful book. This is a book that when you start your own business, you might want to use this to set up your accounting methods. It's very clear, it's very simple, and it works. You can find stuff in it. All right, so this book has a table of contents, as do most of the books we'll look at today. It's set up in sections: sales and accounts receivable, costs and expenses, and financial statements. In the end of the book, there's an index. It's thorough. It's a good index. It's very clear how to find things. Another cool thing about this book is at the end of each chapter, there's a set of 15 test questions. All right? And then in the back of the book, there's answers to those test questions. Now, the test writers know about this, and they're not going to ask the exact same questions, but they're going to ask really similar questions. And if you can practice, after you've gotten the hang of this book, if you can practice going through there and finding this information, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to deal with this. I recall when I took the tests, there was a bunch of stuff about depreciation. There is a good section on financial ratios. That's on page 267. So they talk about several of them: current ratio, quick assets, capital to current liabilities, and so on. They tell you how to use them, what kind of numbers to look for: cash, accounts receivable, bad debts reserves, and so on. There's going to be a bunch of ratio problems. This is one of the books that has them. Okay? So, very straightforward book, very useful. You hope that when you have an accounting question that you can find it in here, because that's where the quickest answers, some of the quickest answers on the test in business and finance in particular goes. This book is only used for business and finance. You cannot bring that in with you to the project management and the contract administration tests. And that's it for the Builder's Guide to Accounting. The next book is the Florida Statutes. You can see I've got the 2021 version. That's the one I used when I took the test. It also has a table of contents. Oh, by the way, it's chapter 455 is the one you bring in. This is the one that you can bring in to the business and finance exam and nothing else. This statute, chapter 455, is also in the Florida Contractors Manual. So if you need it during the other tests, you can look it up in there. So, chapter 455 of the Florida Statutes, this is the table of contents. They all start with 455 because that's the chapter it's in. But then it starts with 01, and then 017, and then 02, and then 0.1, and so on. So as these numbers get bigger, right? So 2035 is halfway between 203 and 204. That's how this works. So there's not a lot of questions that you're going to get out of here, the answers to, but there are a few. And you kind of hope that the answer is in this to a question that you're asked on the test. because it's kind of a pain to go through this, but that's the whole table of contents. 1, 2, 3 pages. So you're not going to have any questions about, for example, education, substituting demonstration of competency for clock hour requirements, or accreditation, or continuing ed, or prosecution of criminal, well, maybe prosecution of criminal violations. That could be in here on the test. Restriction on disciplinary action for student loan default? No, that won't be on there. So you can go through here and understand that you're not going to get asked a question about veterinarians. But there's definitions, there's penalty for theft or reproduction of an examination, so don't even think about it. Mediation, authority to issue citations. There'll be a couple of questions from here on the business and finance exam out of the 120. The Florida statutes. Oh, if you buy this from us, you'd get the one that's most up to date. And that's true of all the books we use. The next one we're going to look at, oh, by the way, we talk about the 13 books. So I'm calling that a book. And I'm calling this a book. This is the AI documents, okay? So there's 3 documents in here. There's the A201, the A401, and the A701. A201 is the general conditions of the contract. A401 is the relationship between the contractor and the subcontractor, and A701 is about bidding. So you can expect to see kind of a bunch of questions come out of A201. That's the biggest of the 3 documents, and it's a book, right? But that's how many pages there are. So you're going to see a bunch of questions from 201, a handful of questions out of the A401, and maybe a question about bidding. Table of contents in these documents is this page. So they call it a table of articles. There's 15 articles in A201. This first one also has an index. So contract questions come out of this book and the next one, the Florida Contractors Manual. You hope that they come out of this one because this is easier to find. They do a really good job of breaking it down. So they talk about general stuff, then they talk about specifics to the owner, the contractor, the architect, and the subcontractors. Talk about construction by owner or by separate contractors, and so on. So that'll give you a category to look in. The other way to go is if there's a question about contingent assignment of subcontracts, it'll be language similar to that. And you can see here, there's 2 places to look. One of them is 5.4, and the other one's 14.2.2.2. Let's take a look. 5.4 would be in Article 5, Section 4. 14.2.2.2 would be in termination or suspension of the contract in Chapter 14, Section 2, Paragraph 2, Part 2. So let's take a look at those. 5.4, that's 8. 5.4 would be Racha. 5.4, and then it says in 5.4, contingent assignment of subcontracts, and then they talk about it. It's all right here. So if the question says it's going to be about this, that's where you're going to find the answer. That's the key to this test, is find the words in the book that most accurately answers the question. That's your job. You don't have to understand it even at this point. You'll have to understand it once you're a contractor, but you got to know how to find it to pass the test so you can become a contractor. That's the deal with this test. The other place you can look for this one, contingent assignments, 14.2.2.2. 14.2.2.2. There's 13, 14. Oh, I'm in the wrong document. Okay, check this out. Here I'm in A201. Here I'm in A401, so I went too far. So it's 14. So now I'm back into A201. 14.2.2.2. Right here. So here talks about surety and prior rights and so on. But this is where termination of by the owner for cause, right here, and that has to do with 14.2.2.2, contingent assignment of subcontract. That's if you have to get rid of somebody, that tells you how to do it. So that's the way that the index works and the table of contents works in this book. The index exists for this first one, for A201. Each of the 3 documents has the table of articles. 201, there's the table of articles. There's 15 articles here. All right, and it's the same system. So we're in 401. This one talks about the subcontract documents, mutual rights and responsibilities. The responsibilities of the contractor and the subcontractor. So as you see, the subcontractor doesn't have to deal with the owner. All right, they have to deal with the contractor. Okay, and the last one, A701, same thing. Table of articles. It's much shorter. Likely to have at most 1 question out of that one, but you'll have a couple, maybe 3, and it could be even more out of the subcontractor document. That's the AIA documents. That's 3 of the 4 books for the business and finance test. This was the first of the books that you can use on the project management and the project management and the contract administration. So here we are in the Florida Contractors Manual. This book was purpose-built to serve this exam, all right? It's also a useful tool to have if you just ignore the fact that we have Google, because there's a whole bunch of really good information in here that contractors use frequently. So they built it. So the Florida legislature gets elected by us, the citizens of Florida. And one thing the Florida legislature wants is for contractors to be good at their jobs, to obey the law, the rules, and to make money. So they do that by having there be a test that you have to pass. And they make it a hard test, because if you can't be bothered to figure out how to pass this test, then you're not going to be bothered to figure out what laws are important and what you need to do. So they hired an organization to write the tests, and they gave them 2 jobs. One is to make it so the test actually tests a useful quality in a potential contractor. And that is that they're a bulldog, and when they have to do something hard that takes a long time and is uncomfortable, they'll do it, because that is a lot of what contractors do. And the other one is make it so almost half the people fail. So it's a high stakes test. They also said pick the books. So they put together a board and they chose these books that we're talking about today. And most of these are existing publications. This one was not. This one got designed by the Construction Industry Licensing Board, or some people that answer to them, to use on the test. And this big honking book has 10 chapters in it. That's the table of contents. So chapter 1 is business planning. Chapter 2 is licensing, financial management, risk management, labor, workers' comp, safety, contracts and subcontracts, liens and payment bonds, and project management. Each chapter has a table of contents. Here's the table of contents for chapter 1. All right, it's 2 pages long. All 10 have that. And there's an index as well. And that index is across the entire book. This book has a ton of information. Some of it's very hard to find. I've identified some hidden content that if it wasn't done on purpose, sure could have been, that you could use. So when you're writing a test and you want to have a certain percentage of people to fail, you got to look for ways to make people fail. One way is to make them really uncomfortable and make the test not just hard, but exhausting. And when you do that, then a lot of people just quit. So they depend on people just quitting. And another way is to have some questions. It's open book, so all the information's here. So another strategy that they use is find some questions that are so hard to find that people are going to take a half an hour looking it up, and that burns a whole bunch of time in the test. And if you don't look at every question, then there's going to be some easy questions probably that you could have gotten right, but you didn't look at them. That happened to me when I took the test. I got really interested in one of the problems, and I spent probably 25 minutes on it, and it almost cost me. You got to have discipline in this test. Anyway, this book is really useful for them to get their almost 50% failure rate. So, business planning and organization. Table of contents, all right? There it is. Tells you what page it's on, tells you what it's about. This one's really straightforward. They hire an individual to write each of these chapters, and from time to time they update this book when rules change or there's other things they want to emphasize. And then sometimes the same person will write the chapter again, and they get paid for this. This is a sweet job to write a chapter in this book. I mean, it gets published and they make a little bit of money every time one of them's sold. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2. So you see the page numbering system here. This is chapter 1. So this is chapter 1.5, 1.7. So this is page 9 of chapter 1. Now, here I am in chapter 2, licensing. This guy here, he's a board certified by the Florida Bar as a specialist in city, county, and local government law. So he wrote this. This is about licensing. So professional regulation. Contractors are regulated by this outfit. So are barbers. So are pool guys or construction people. So are bars. So rules for running a business in Florida, right here. Regulation of contractors in Florida. That's he talks about chapter 489 of the Florida Statutes. And so on. Certified construction contractors, the experience in education, GC, RC, there's a building contractor as well, swimming pool contractor, and so on. So there are attachments here, and that's other chapters of the Florida Statutes. And that's chapter 2. Chapter 3. It's a big honking book. Chapter 3 is financial management. So here we go. There's the index. There's a table of contents. Tells you what's going on. Page intentionally left blank. That's so that's chapter 3. Then we move on to chapter 4. That's 5. Darn it, I skipped right over 4. Risk management, table of contents, suretyship, the principle of indemnity. This is, if you need to get to sleep at night, if you're an insomniac, you read this chapter. Actually, there's a few of them like this. There's a bunch of forms at the end of this one. Chapter 5, labor and employment law. Charles S. Calkins, Esquire. So he wrote this chapter, table of contents, whole bunch of labor stuff in here. There's a bunch of discussions of a lot of different laws. So if the question says, according to the Florida Clean Indoor Air Act, you want to look here. All right? This is the book you look in if it's not clear where it's going to be. In general, you want this to be the last book you look for the answer in, because this in general is the hardest place to find stuff. So that's chapter 5. Chapter 5 runs along for a long time, and that gets us to chapter 6. Workers' comp. So workers' comp starts here and runs through, and it's actually in there. So workers' comp is part of this chapter, the actual law. That's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is safety. Many of you can guess that is going to be this. All right, so there's going to be questions about safety. This is maybe the only place where I would look here before I would look at the primary source book, because that book is a pain. So here's the safety chapter. They talk about OSHA stuff in here, coverage of the OSHA Act, and so on, examples. So here is a summary of a lot of this stuff. So if it's an easy OSHA question, it's going to be in this book. That's unusual for this test. But there you go. The next chapter is chapter 8, which is construction contracts and liability. I think this guy wrote these laws personally. He did this chapter and chapter 9. So this is for construction contracts and subcontracts. You want to hope that the answer is in here because this is easy to find. This is more thorough. It's harder to find, but it's all in here. So that's chapter 8. It's brief and densely packed. All right, so chapter 8 is done after like 26 pages. And then we get to construction lien laws. Same guy, Larry Levy, Esquire. He's a professor at Florida International. And I mean, if you got a question, you can call the dude up. There's his phone number and there's his email address. So he talks about construction liens, talks about final payment affidavit, talks about statutes with bonds, exemplary payment bond, and so on. So that's chapter 8 and chapter 9. And then the final chapter is chapter 10, and that's about project management. Written by Paul Del Vecchio, who has been in the Florida contracting industry for 40 years. And this chapter, which is really, you should consider it as a book, has estimating and bidding, plans and specs, estimates, equipment estimates, labor estimates, construction contracts, the kinds of contracts, cost breakdown, sample cost records, whole bunch of information in here, a whole lot of specific stuff. There's case studies in here that will probably be useful in one or two questions. There will be questions out of this chapter, and there will be questions in every chapter across these 3 exams out of this book. After this, it's the index. So, one thing to note, they list out the Florida Administrative Code here. There's 3 of them that are in this book. They list out the Florida statutes that are within this book. This is useful. It might say, according to chapter 489 of the Florida statutes, well, they have it, all right? You can look it up. If they say that, go there first and look for it because you can find it right in the law. The index is not thorough, but there's a lot of stuff you can find in here, all right? Again, if they didn't do this on purpose, they certainly could have, but there's hidden content buried in this book. It's hard to find everything you need in here. There's so much information in here that it's easy to spend too much time on a problem. Get used to this book. This book will make or break you on this test. All right, so that is the Florida Contractors Manual. So to recall, these 2 can be used on both tests. These 4 can be used on the business and finance. These 2 go away for the project management and the contract administration. So moving right along, might as well go to the next most excruciating book. The Florida Contractors Manual, in my opinion, is the most excruciating book. The OSHA book, the 29 CFR 1926 OSHA Construction Industry Regs and Standards, is right here. All right, so the first part of this book is updates only on those pages. Then there's a very thorough table of contents. It's so thorough that it's almost not useful because it's got everything, although that's not fair. I mean, inspection, citations, and penalties, recording and reporting injuries and illnesses, all right? And then there's subparts of each of these. General industry standards on construction work, all right? Scuba diving, mixed gas diving, ionizing radiation. And that's subparts all the way up to O, Q, R, S, underground construction, caissons, cofferdams, compressed air. You can get real specific in here. Subpart W, subpart Z, subpart AA, confined spaces in construction. That's a good one. That's where people die. Cranes and derricks in construction. This is one of a couple of things that are only on building and general contracting, and residential does not have any questions about cranes and derricks in construction. And then general duty clause, there's a couple of appendices, designations for general industry standards. Here's side boom cranes, and so on. I don't highlight. There's a couple of specific places where I highlighted, and I talk about that in the test prep that I sell. But I used a book that was highlighted, and everything was highlighted. And when you highlight everything, you can't find anything. And here, it's already kind of self-highlighted. So this is really busy pages, really densely packed. The table of contents is thorough. The index, also quite thorough. All right? So if you want to talk about benzene, if there's a benzene question, you can look it up. Safety belts, 260 and 277, that's where the most important ones are, is the red ones. Actually, that's the page number. The red is the actual page number. And then, so for example, medical surveillance about asbestos is at 1926, that's the name of this code, .1101 M, and it's on page 459. So let's take a look at 459. 459, and it's 1101 M. So there's 1101N. So 1101 M continues. That's 4, 3, 2, 1. 1926.1101, medical surveillance, is right there. All right? So the M, because this, L was housekeeping, M is medical surveillance, N is record keeping. So you can track this. You can use this, the way this is broken down, to figure out exactly where everything is. I spent probably 20 minutes on a question that I knew I should be able to find in here. And it had to do with scaffolding and how far of a setback there has to be between the actual scaffolding that was a certain height and where there was an exposed sidewalk that things could fall off and bonk people in the head. And I spent so long on that, and I should have just given up after 3 minutes and then come back to it. I did not. Don't get caught in that trap. This book will trap you if you're not careful. So remember that. That's going to be important while you're taking the test. So that's the OSHA book. Energy efficient building construction in Florida. This can also all these books, starting with OSHA, starting with the OSHA book, the rest of these books can only be used in project management and contract administration. This is one of them. This is published by the University of Florida. It's the 10th edition. No, it's the 11th edition now. I used the 10th edition when I took it. We have the 11th edition that we're selling. I found there to be either 2 or 3 questions when I took the test. And that varies from testing date to testing date. But you can expect about that much. Table of contents. There's 11 chapters, step-by-step energy efficient construction, why build efficiently, and so on. There's mortgage rate tables, fingertip facts, chapter 8 notes. So there's step-by-step. They just go through the basics of energy efficient stuff. Here's the way HVAC works, all right? That's designing it for efficiency. Continuous insulation system. Test ducts for airtightness. So it tells you how to do a duct tester assembly. Sealing ductwork tells you how to do it. Chapter 4, building as a system. Mold on the walls, mysterious odors, excessive cooling and heating bills, high humidity. So if there's an an energy related question, it's going to either be in this book or in the Florida Code for energy conservation. As you work with these, you'll get kind of a sense of which one is what. If it's a rule, if it's a law, it's in that one. If it's information and how to do stuff in the best way, it could be in either, but you might want to look in here. This also has An index, some other forms of leading, low pressure sodium. All right, so before we get to the index, there's a bunch of resources. So, I mean, when you're doing the work, you might want to look up Energy Star appliances. You might want to look up product rebate finders. I mean, there's good information in here. Appendices, mortgage rate tables. So ordinarily you just Google it, but you can't do that in this test because you can't access the internet, but you can use this. I don't remember there being a mortgage question for amortization, but if it comes up, it's in here. Fingertip facts, all right? BBL is a barrel. KW is a kilowatt. KWH, kilowatt hour. 1 kilowatt hour is 3,412 BTUs. So there's a whole bunch of conversions. R values for various things. Chapter 8 notes, conversion of fuel costs. Multiply dollars per kilowatt hour by 293 to obtain electrical costs in dollars per MBTU. If you need them, you got them. Now there's an index. It's pretty good. They do a nice job. Florida Building Code 7th edition, energy conservation. So they kind of point to all these things, but you're going to have the book with you. Lamps, the ballast, the comparison and efficacy, and so on. That is energy efficient building construction in Florida. The Truss book, the BCSI, the Building Component Safety Information, produced by SBCA, which I don't remember what that stands for. Structural Building Components Association. Okay, table of contents, thorough. So there's an introduction. There's unit conversions here too. There is, as I recall, there's no index in this one, but there's a glossary of terms. This will probably be useful. As I recall, there was a question that I got an answer to it out of here. Again, your mileage may vary. They can pick questions. Well, actually, they can pick answers in any one of these books, and then they write a question about it. So in this book, as I recall, I remember a question about handling, job site handling. It was on page 3, and crane use, proper truss handling. And I also recall the permanent restraint bracing of cords and web members. So there's a lot of information. There's a bunch of tables. So tables are a good place to find a question or to find an answer that you can write a question about if you're a test writer. All right. So the tables, maximum top cord temporary lateral restraint spacing. So if the question was, if you got a truss span of 32 feet, what's the top cord temporary lateral restraint spacing? The old TCTLR. Well, 8 foot on center maximum. Familiarize yourself with this stuff. That's the truss book. I think there were 2 questions when I took the test. And now we're looking at Principles and Practices of Commercial Construction, the 11th edition. This is written by the same outfit that wrote the tests, that writes the test. It's Pearson. It's a Pearson book. There it is. Some basic units and their conversions. Good table of contents. Practice of commercial construction, site evaluation and layout. This book is where these probably come from. Because, and at least you hope it is, because it's harder to find them in other books. Foundations, site development, material movement, excavations, structural steel, reinforced concrete, and so on. This one is set up like a book. I mean, it's just chapters, page numbers, go for it. Indemnification, a means to transfer liability from one party to another party, usually us. Roof framing and coverings, truss construction, so here's more truss information. And at the end, a thorough index. Soil compaction, test 4. That's in the content. So you can find this in the Florida Contractors Manual, and you can find it here. This will be less information than the FCM, but it's probably easier to find. Stonework, anchors for, and so on. Principles and practices of commercial construction. All right, now we're down to the Florida Building Codes, the FBCs. So here we have building. All right, these, most of you are probably most familiar with these books out of all the ones we've talked about here. These books are also set up so it's easy to find stuff in. That's what they're designed to do, because it's really important that contractors can access these building codes in a reasonable way. So these are already tabbed. You'll notice if you take a look at our books, I don't tab the books because, again, that's too much information, too many choices. Here, they're already tagged, and they're tagged in a really useful way. They're tabbed by chapters, all right? So chapter 1 is the scope and administration. Chapter 2 is definitions. Everywhere you see definitions, that's a big deal. Because that's just ready-made answers for them to write questions about. Chapter 3 is use and occupancy classification, and there's a jillion chapters in this book, all right? So if you go to any chapter, scope and application, part 1, and it's chapter 1, so it's 101, okay? Chapter 2 is 201. Chapter 3, you guessed it, 301. Chapter 7, what do you want to bet? You win, 701. So you can just look at these, and if it's according to Florida statute or according to Florida building codes, what about accessibility? Well, there's a chapter about accessibility here, but it's just reserved for a bunch of other stuff. There's also another book on accessibility that there's going to be a lot more information. Similarly with energy efficiency. They just reserve some space, but there's a whole book about it. Special inspections and tests in chapter 17. So it just talks about tests. There may be a question about tests. Chapter 19 is concrete, aluminum, masonry, steel, wood, glass and glazing, and so on. Some of these are reserved, all right? But there's an index. So you can use this as a table of contents, and there's also an index. So if the question wants to know about egress, well, it'd be 1018 and 1029. So that'd be, I think, 10. Chapter 10, 1018 and 1029. One, 1. 1018 aisles and 1029. Assembly. Room or space used for assembly purposes that contains seats, tables, displays, equipment, or other materials to comply. And so there's something about it in here. Capacity of aisle for assembly. Okay? So if it has anything to do with the Florida Building Code, there'll be a word, and that word you'll have to find, that's a key word. You'll have to find either that word or a word like it in the table of contents or in the index of the proper book. Okay? So all the time on this test, when you read a question, the process should be, what book do I want to look in first? And if it says, according to the Florida Building Code, you want to look in one of these bad boys. Here's the Florida Building Code Residential. All right. This is the one I use. It's 2020. And what we're selling now is the 2023s, I think. That's the newest update. Maybe 2024. I don't remember. But whichever one it is, that's the one we got. Same way this is set up. So, all right. So building is for everything. All right. Every building has to fit in the building codes. but there's more specifics about residential. They have separate rules in addition to the building codes for residential. Here's the chapters. They get into more detail about what you can do in a place where people live. And I didn't mention this in the other book, but there's at the end of each of these books. Oh man, must not destroy my books. There's a chunk of these books. If you just bear with me here, I'm getting there. You can see them now. It's appendixes, all right? So you could spend a lot of time in an appendix. But so some of them might be useful. If you have time at the end, you might be able to find some stuff in the appendix, but you can see the provisions contained in this appendix are not mandatory unless specifically referenced in the adopting ordinance. All right? So there might be information for questions in the appendix. I don't think, that's if you have extra time at the end of the test. Okay? So that's this. This also has an index. It's a pretty good one. Same as the building codes, and it gets you right to it. Okay, so that's that one. Now we got accessibility. Same format. Chapters. Chapter 3 is building blocks. Floor or ground surfaces, carpet, general, changes in level, turning space. It just lays out what you can do and what you can't as far as accessibility is concerned. So ADA questions are probably in here if it has to do with the building code. If it has to do with statute, it's in the contractor's manual. Every time you read a question, you register the keyword in your head, and then you got to start immediately pick the book where the easiest answer would show up, and then use your time to see if you can find the easiest answer. And if the clock starts ticking, starts getting away from you, then save that question for later in the test and go back and read the next question. Because the most critical thing is that you read every question. So it's like in the NFL. You got to win the games you're supposed to win. Yeah, it's probably more true of the NHL. In any case, special room spaces and elements, communication elements and features, same deal. There's index. So there's a figures index, so that they show you all the pictures. So these are pretty useful in this book in particular. Fair housing guidelines and federal burial removal. Barrier, not burial. All right, so there's no index in this book. It's all pretty much on the table of contents, and the list of figures is the only index you're really going to see. All right, that's accessibility. Here we have Florida Building Code, existing building. Same deal. Scope and administration, definitions. Definitions are a big deal. Repairs, prescriptive compliance, index. So this is Appendix B, standard for rehabilitation. Appendix A is seismic strengthening provisions for unreinforced masonry bearing wall buildings. Resource A, guidelines on fire rating. It's reserved. There's nothing there yet. And then a big honking index. Existing, height, historic, relocatable, carpeting, ceiling, certificate of occupancy. All right. And then they also give you the FBC, Florida Building Code Administration. The scope of administration is right here. So who's in charge of this? Well, Florida, and it's laid out here. And then our final book today, and your final book for these 3 exams, the Florida Building Code Energy Conservation. We got shorted one set of tabs, so my son swapped in his tabs for this one. They're usually prettier than this, but it's the same deal as the rest of the books. And this is section 304, 301, so that's chapter 3. Your tabs will actually say what the table of contents is. There's an index in the end of this. Same deal. Fenestration product, site built, defined. Fenestration is windows. Default U factors and so on. ducts defined, insulation, ceiling. So everything you need to, well, all the rules you got to follow if you're building, and if you're doing a building and you're paying attention to energy conservation. So that was the books, the approved reference books for the general contracting, building contracting, and residential contracting license exams. There are 4 of the 13 that you can use for business and finance. There are 11 that you can use on the other 2 exams. That's project management and contract administration. You got to pass all 3 of these bad boys with a 70% in order to get licensed in the state of Florida. If you like this, like the video. If you have any questions about it, if there's something that was not clear, by all means, license2pass@gmail.com, or you can just leave a message on this video. Stay tuned for more stuff. This is Paul from License to Pass. I am out.